The alarms had never gone off before, not once in the 11 years I had worn this crown, and now they were screaming through every corridor of my palace, at the exact moment I finally understood what I had married. I am Illyra Vantrell, crown ruler of the Threnai Dominion, and before I tell you what happened on the day the sky split open above my capital, I need to tell you how it began, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. I found him on a burial moon, a place my people used only for the dead, where no ship was supposed to travel and no living thing was supposed to breathe. I was there for a ceremony, standing over the resting place of my mother, when my scouts found wreckage scattered across 3 kilometers of gray dust. At the center of it, barely alive, was a creature none of us recognized. 2 arms, 2 legs, soft skin, without a single natural weapon, no claws, no plating, nothing that should have let him survive a crash that had torn his vessel into 1,000 burning pieces. My guards wanted to end him where he lay. That was the law. Unknown craft in restricted space meant intrusion, and intrusion meant judgment, swift and final. I was the one who said wait. I still do not fully know why I said it. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the way his chest kept rising and falling, stubborn, refusing to stop, even with half his blood painting the dust beneath him. Perhaps it was simply that I was tired of watching things die that day, standing as I was over my own mother's grave. I ordered him carried to the medical bay of my flagship instead of left for the moon to keep. He did not wake for 6 days. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he did was apologize. Not threaten, not demand, not try to fight the restraints my physicians had placed on him out of caution. He looked at the ceiling, then at me, and said, in a broken version of our trade language he must have learned from some old transmission, that he was sorry for intruding, and that he hoped he had not caused anyone trouble by crashing on what was clearly someone's sacred ground. I remember laughing, not out of mockery, though my guards certainly took it that way. I laughed because in 11 years of rule, surrounded by generals who measured worth in kill counts and ministers who smiled with their teeth bared like a challenge, no one had ever apologized to me for anything, let alone for the crime of nearly dying on my land. His name was Ethan Cole. He said he came from a small, unremarkable world called Earth, a place so far from the Dominion's charted lanes that my astronomers needed 4 months just to confirm it existed. He said he had been a passenger on a research vessel that suffered a catastrophic failure and that the escape pod had simply chosen the nearest rock with enough gravity to land on. He said he was nobody important. A teacher, he told me. A man who used to explain history to children in a small brick building, who grew vegetables on weekends, who had never held a weapon in his life except once, briefly, badly, for a hunting trip he did not enjoy. I believed every word. Why would I not? He flinched at the sight of my honor guard's ceremonial blades. He apologized to a servant for accidentally bumping into her, then apologized again the next day for having apologized too much the first time. He asked, gently, if he could help in the palace kitchens once he was strong enough to walk, and my kitchen staff, utterly bewildered by the request, allowed it out of sheer curiosity. Within a season, he had turned an unused courtyard into a garden, growing food that none of us recognized, sharing it freely with anyone who wandered close enough to ask what it was. My court did not know what to make of him. Threnai society is built on strength, on the belief that softness is a weakness to be pitied or removed. We measure a person's worth by how well they can dominate a room, how sharp their words cut, how steady their hand is on a weapon. Ethan Cole had none of that. He was quiet in rooms full of shouting. He deferred instead of demanded. My ministers called him my pet, my curiosity, my strange little indulgence from the burial moon, and for a long while I let them believe that too, because it was easier than explaining what I was actually feeling. I was falling for him. Not despite his softness, because of it. I had spent my entire life around people who wanted something from me. My throne, my favor, my blood for their bloodline. Ethan wanted nothing. He asked for nothing beyond a place to grow his strange vegetables and someone to talk to in the evenings. When I finally told him I wished for him to remain in the palace permanently, not as a guest, not as a curiosity, but as my husband, he looked genuinely stunned, as if the idea had never once crossed his mind that a ruler of an empire spanning 40 worlds might want a gentle, unarmed teacher from a backwater planet at her side. The wedding caused an uproar that lasted for months. Generals petitioned me to reconsider. Ministers whispered that I was disgracing centuries of Threnai tradition by placing a soft, weaponless outsider at my side. One particularly bold advisor, a sharp-tongued woman named Soren, told me directly that my mother would have been ashamed. I told her that my mother had spent her whole reign surrounded by people pretending to love her for her power, and that I would rather spend mine loved honestly by a man who grew vegetables and apologized too much. Soren did not have a response to that. We married on the same moon where I had found him, which some called poetic and others called reckless, given its history. I remember standing across from him during the ceremony, watching his hands shake slightly, not from fear of the vows, but from the sheer number of armored guards standing witness. He leaned close afterward and whispered that he had never expected, growing up in his small brick house on a small forgotten planet, that his life would ever look like this. I believed him completely. In the years that followed, our life together was, by every measure I understood, peaceful. He never asked to sit in on war councils. He never expressed interest in weapons, tactics, or the endless political games that consumed my days. When ambassadors from rival systems visited, he would greet them warmly, offer them food from his garden, and then quietly excuse himself before the real negotiations began, saying with a small smile that politics gave him a headache. We had a daughter together. We named her Wren, a name from his world that he said meant something small but resilient. She had my coloring and his gentle laugh, and watching him with her, patient beyond anything I had ever witnessed in my own upbringing, only deepened what I felt for him. He taught her to garden before she could properly walk. He told her stories about a blue and green planet she would likely never see, stories about oceans and forests and small towns where nothing dangerous ever happened. I want to be honest with you, because this story deserves honesty even in its gentlest chapter. There were small things, tiny inconsistencies that I noticed over those years and chose, deliberately, not to examine too closely. He never slept with his back toward a door, not once, not even in our own bedroom where no threat had ever existed. He always knew, without seeming to look, where every exit in a room was located, even in chambers he had visited 100 times before. Once, a new servant startled him from behind while carrying a tray of fruit, and for half a heartbeat, before either of us understood what was happening, a small paring knife from that same tray was resting against the servant's wrist, not drawing blood, simply present, simply there, faster than my eye could track. He apologized immediately, profusely, blaming an old habit from a difficult childhood, some story about growing up in a rough part of his town. The servant, shaken but unharmed, accepted the apology. I let it go too, because the alternative was to ask questions I was not certain I wanted answered, about the harmless, gentle teacher I had built an entire life around. There were rumors too, faint ones, drifting in from border provinces near the edge of our charted space. Talk of strange outsiders, not Threnai, not any species my scouts recognized, moving quietly through neutral territories, asking after a human matching a very specific description, using a name that was not Ethan Cole. I heard these rumors the way one hears distant thunder on a clear day, present, but easy to dismiss, easy to fold back into the calm of an otherwise beautiful sky. I did not know then that thunder always arrives eventually, whether you choose to listen for it or not. For years, our life continued in that same gentle rhythm. Mornings in the garden with Wren, evenings where Ethan cooked meals using ingredients he had grown himself, dishes unlike anything in Threnai cuisine, rich and warm, and made with a patience that felt like an extension of who he was. Nights where he held me and told me, again and again, how grateful he was that I had chosen not to leave him on that burial moon. I remember one particular evening, not long before everything changed, when Ren asked him why he never wanted to learn how to use a blade, since every other adult in the palace seemed to carry one. He smiled at her, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and told her that the strongest thing a person could do was choose kindness, even when the world gave them every reason not to. I believed that too, completely, the way I believed everything he told me. I had built an entire understanding of my husband around one simple, comforting idea, that he was harmless, that the softness I saw every single day was the whole truth of him, not a mask, not a choice, not the surface of something far deeper hidden beneath. I did not yet know that harmless and safe are not always the same word. I did not yet know that the man growing vegetables in my courtyard, apologizing to servants, teaching our daughter about kindness, had once been something else entirely, something his own people feared enough to want erased. I would learn all of it soon enough, on the day the alarms finally screamed, on the day his enemies found him at last, and I discovered that the gentlest man I had ever known had simply been waiting, patiently, for a storm he always knew was coming. The first time I truly should have been afraid, I mistook it for something else entirely, and that mistake cost me years of understanding a truth that was standing directly in front of me. It happened 3 years into our marriage, during a diplomatic gathering meant to smooth relations with a neighboring cluster of worlds we call the Ashvane Compact. Ethan rarely attended these events, preferring the quiet of his garden, but that evening he had come along at my request, mostly to keep Ren occupied while the adults spoke in circles about trade routes and border rights. A delegate from the Ashvane side, a broad-shouldered man named Colonel Ren, had drunk more than he should have and grew loud, then careless, then physical, grabbing the wrist of a young serving girl who had accidentally spilled a drink near his boots. It was a small moment, over in seconds, the kind of thing my guards would have handled within a breath. Except Ethan was closer. I watched him move, or rather, I watched the space where he had been standing, and then watched him already at Ren's side, one hand gently but firmly guiding the colonel's grip open, releasing the girl without a mark on her, without a sound loud enough to draw the room's attention. He said something quiet to Ren, something I did not hear, and the colonel's face went pale before he sat back down and did not speak again for the rest of the evening. I asked Ethan about it later that night, half amused, half curious. He shrugged it off with an easy laugh, saying he used to break up disagreements between students back at the school where he taught, and that some habits simply stayed with a person. I remember thinking, at the time, how sweet it was that even his instinct for conflict was rooted in gentleness, in protecting someone smaller than himself. I did not think, not once, to ask how a man who had never held a weapon could disable a trained soldier twice his size so quickly that even my own guards, standing only a few paces away, had not registered the movement until it was already finished. That was the pattern of those years. Small moments, easily explained, easily folded into the comforting story I had already written about who my husband was, a man who flinched from violence, but somehow always knew exactly how to end it before it began. A man who claimed no formal training of any kind, but moved through dangerous situations with a stillness that felt less like instinct and more like memory. There was the incident with the assassin, though at the time none of us called it that. A courier arrived at the palace claiming to carry documents from a border settlement, requesting a private audience with me regarding a land dispute. It was mundane enough that my guards allowed him through the outer checkpoints with only a standard search. Ethan happened to be walking through the same corridor, carrying Ren on his shoulders, humming some tune from his childhood world. He stopped walking 3 full seconds before the courier reached for something hidden beneath his jacket. 3 seconds, which does not sound like much until you understand that my finest guards, trained from birth in threat detection, did not react until the object was already half drawn. Ethan set Wren down gently, told her to stay very still, and then simply stepped between the courier and the rest of the hallway. What followed happened too quickly for me to properly describe, even now, even with years to think it over. The courier ended up disarmed and restrained against the corridor wall, uninjured but utterly immobilized, before my guards had even finished drawing their own weapons. Ethan's expression, when I finally reached the scene, was not fear, not adrenaline, not the shaken look of a man who had just faced potential danger for the first time. It was calm, almost bored. He apologized to me afterward, of course, the way he apologized for everything, saying he did not know what came over him, that seeing Wren in danger must have triggered some deep parental instinct he did not know he possessed. I accepted the explanation because it was easier than the alternative, because questioning it meant admitting that the man I loved, the soft-spoken gardener who told our daughter that kindness was the strongest thing a person could offer, had a version of himself I had never been introduced to. My war council was less forgiving of my blindness than I was. General Vask, a broad, scarred veteran who had served under my mother before me, requested a private meeting not long after the courier incident. He was blunt, as he always was with me, telling me directly that something about my husband did not sit right with him. He said that, in his decades of service, he had learned to recognize a particular kind of stillness in certain soldiers, the ones who had seen enough violence that their bodies simply stopped registering it as unusual. He said Ethan Cole moved like a man who had lived through things far worse than a diplomatic scuffle or a nervous courier. I dismissed him, not cruelly, but firmly. I told him that Ethan was a teacher, a gardener, a gentle father, and that seeing danger in every quiet man who happened to protect his family was perhaps a habit General Vask should examine in himself rather than in my husband. Vask did not push further, though I remember the look on his face, somewhere between worry and resignation, as though he had said everything he could say and simply had to hope I was right. I was not right. The rumors from the border provinces grew louder during this same period, though I continued treating them the way one treats background noise, present but unimportant, easy to fold beneath the comfort of daily life. Traders passing through our outer territories spoke of strangers, humans, though not from any charted route my astronomers recognized, moving quietly through neutral space. These strangers asked pointed questions in small settlements, always the same questions, about a man matching a very specific description, always using a name that was not Ethan Cole. Some traders called the name Widow, others called it something closer to Warden. None of the reports agreed exactly, which made it easy for me to dismiss the whole matter as confused gossip distorted across multiple translations. I brought it up with Ethan exactly once, casually, over a quiet dinner after Wren had gone to sleep. I mentioned, lightly, that strange humans were asking about someone matching his description near the border, and I watched his face for a reaction. For just a moment, barely longer than a breath, something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, something closer to exhaustion, the look of a man remembering a weight he had hoped to leave behind permanently. Then it passed, and he smiled, and told me that Earth was a much larger and stranger place than I understood, and that plenty of humans probably shared similar features, and that it was likely nothing more than a case of mistaken identity from confused traders who had never actually seen an Earth person up close before arriving in our systems. I let it go. Again. I want to be honest about why I kept letting it go, because it would be easy to claim ignorance and leave it there, but the truth is more complicated. I did not want to know. I had built a life, a genuinely happy one, around the story of a harmless man who loved me and our daughter without complication, without danger, without the political weight that suffocated everyone else in my life. Questioning that story meant risking losing it, and I was not brave enough, not yet, to trade my comfortable fiction for whatever truth waited beneath it. Wren grew older during those years, curious and sharp in the way children of powerful families often become, absorbing far more from the adults around her than any of us realized. She began asking her father questions I myself had avoided asking, small ones at first, about why he sometimes woke in the night, breathing hard, about why he always chose the seat in a room that faced the door, about a faint marking on his shoulder that looked, to her young eyes, like something had once cut deep enough to leave a permanent trace. He answered her the way he answered everyone, gently, deflecting with warmth rather than lies exactly, though I have since come to understand that omission can be its own quiet kind of untruth. He told her that everyone carries old marks from a difficult past, and that what mattered was not where you came from, but what kind of person you chose to become afterward. I remember thinking, at the time, how wise that sounded, how much it sounded like the man I had fallen for on that burial moon so many years ago. I did not yet understand that it was also, in its own way, a warning I had simply failed to hear. There was another moment, one I have returned to often since, that I did not think much of at the time. A visiting scholar from a distant cluster had come to study Threnai governance, and during a formal dinner he made an offhand remark about how easily a soft, unarmed species could be conquered by any determined enemy. He said it lightly, almost as a joke, glancing toward Ethan with the kind of dismissive amusement my own court had once shown him. Ethan smiled politely, said nothing in response, and continued eating his meal as though the comment had not registered at all. It was only later, walking back to our chambers, that I noticed his jaw was tight, his shoulders slightly raised, a tension I mistook for simple embarrassment on behalf of his species rather than something closer to old, private grief. When I asked him about it, he told me that the scholar was not entirely wrong, that soft things could indeed be conquered, but that the ones who survived long enough to stop being soft rarely spoke about it afterward, because the cost of that change was rarely worth celebrating. I did not understand the full weight of that statement until much later, when I finally understood exactly what kind of cost he meant. The final months, before everything changed, were, on the surface, the calmest of our entire marriage. Ethan expanded his garden further than ever before, teaching Wren how to grow food from seeds he had somehow preserved from his original crash, dishes I still cannot properly describe to you because nothing in Threnai cuisine compares to them. He grew quieter in the evenings, more thoughtful, occasionally staring out toward the horizon with an expression I mistook for simple homesickness. Looking back now, I understand it was something closer to a soldier watching weather roll in from a great distance, recognizing the shape of a storm long before anyone else in the room could see the clouds. I asked him, once, during one of those quiet evenings, whether he was truly happy with the life we had built together, whether some part of him regretted trading whatever existence he once had for a palace full of Threnai politics and a wife who ruled 40 worlds. He took my hand, looked at me with an honesty I mistook completely at the time, and told me that everything before me had simply been preparation for this, for Wren, for our garden, for the quiet life he had never believed he deserved to have. I believed him entirely. I did not understand, not until the sky itself tore open above my capital only weeks later, that preparation can mean many different things, and that the man across from me had spent his entire life becoming exactly the kind of person capable of protecting everything he loved, even if it meant becoming someone I had never truly met. The morning it happened began with an alert no one in my war room had ever been trained to interpret, because no one believed such an alert would ever need to be issued. I was reviewing trade reports with Minister Soren when General Vask burst into the chamber without announcement, something he had not done in the 11 years he had served me. His face carried a look I had only seen once before, on the day my mother died. He told me our outer defense grid, a network of sensors and shield arrays that had never once failed in 3 generations, had gone completely dark across an entire sector, and that something massive had crossed the boundary without triggering a single alarm. I asked him how that was possible. He said it was not. He said, and I remember his exact words because they refused to leave my mind afterward, that whatever had entered our space had done so as though our entire defense network simply did not exist. We reached the observation deck in time to see it with our own eyes, a shape descending through the atmosphere that matched nothing in our recognition databases, dark and angular and utterly silent, moving with a precision that felt less like a machine and more like a living thing that had simply decided our sky belonged to it now. I remember reaching for Wren instinctively, though she was safely with her tutors several floors below, a reflex from a mother's fear rather than a ruler's logic. I remember Soren's hand gripping my arm, her voice tight, asking me who these people were and why our shields had failed to even register their approach. I did not have an answer, not yet. The ship settled into the central plaza of my capital, close enough that its shadow swallowed 3 entire buildings, and from its opening hatch emerged figures unlike anything my scouts had ever documented crossing our borders before. Human, or close enough to human that the distinction barely mattered at first glance, dressed in matte armor without insignia, moving with a coordinated silence that reminded me, in a way I could not yet fully articulate, of someone I already knew. Their leader stepped forward alone, unarmored compared to the others, a tall man with graying hair and a face carved from patience rather than kindness. He introduced himself, through a translator device clipped to his collar, as Colonel Marlowe Hale, representing an organization he called the Ashen Directive, and he said, calmly, politely, in a tone that chilled me more than any shouted threat could have, that he was here to collect an asset that belonged to his people. I asked him what asset. I already suspected the answer before he spoke it. He said a name, not Ethan Cole, a designation instead, cold and clinical, something that sounded less like a person and more like a weapon, given a serial number instead of a life. I told him, as firmly as my voice could manage while my hands trembled at my sides, that no such asset existed within my palace, that he had made an error crossing into sovereign Threnai territory, and that he needed to withdraw his vessel immediately or face the full response of my armed forces. Colonel Hale smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had heard that exact threat delivered by a dozen different rulers across a dozen different worlds, and had walked away from every single one of them without a scratch. He said quite simply that my armed forces were welcome to try. I ordered Vask to mobilize every available unit. Within minutes, my capital's defense forces surrounded the plaza, weapons trained on the strange vessel and its silent, armored escort. I stood at the edge of the observation platform, watching my own people prepare to defend a home I had ruled my entire adult life, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely, completely afraid. That fear multiplied tenfold when I turned and found Ethan standing directly behind me. I had not heard him arrive. Wren was not with him, which meant he had already moved her somewhere he believed was safe before coming to find me, a detail I would only fully appreciate later. His face held none of the softness I had spent 11 years falling in love with. It had not vanished entirely, but it had receded, pulled back like water retreating before a wave, revealing something underneath that had clearly always been there, patiently waiting. He told me, in a voice quieter and steadier than I had ever heard from him, to take our guards and get behind the reinforced doors at the rear of the palace. He said it the way a person gives an instruction they fully expect to be obeyed without question, and for one disorienting moment, I did not recognize the man giving it. I refused. I told him I would not abandon my own capital while an unknown force occupied its central plaza. I demanded to know who Colonel Hale was, what asset he was speaking of, and why an entire warship had crossed our defenses as though they were nothing more than decoration. Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression broke my heart even faster than it would later terrify me. He said he was sorry. He said he had hoped, genuinely hoped, that this day would never come, that he had built our entire life together, believing enough time had passed that his old world had finally stopped looking for him. He did not have time to explain further, because Colonel Hale's voice carried across the plaza through some amplification device, calling out a name that was not Ethan Cole, followed by a simple demand that the asset surrender himself within the next 60 seconds, or the entire capital would be considered a legitimate target. I watched my husband close his eyes briefly, take one slow breath, and then walk toward the edge of the platform without a single trace of hesitation. I grabbed his arm. I told him he was not a soldier, that he had never held a weapon in 11 years of marriage, that whatever he thought he could do against an armored force with a warship at their back would only get him killed in front of our daughter's window. He turned back to me, and for the first time since I had found him bleeding on that burial moon so many years earlier, I saw something in his eyes that I had never once witnessed. Not fear, not the gentle patience he showed Ren every evening in the garden. Something colder, older, carved from experiences he had clearly spent every day of our marriage trying to keep buried far beneath the surface. He told me, quietly, that he had never lied to me about who he was. He said everything I had seen, the gardener, the teacher, the father who taught kindness above all else, all of it was real, all of it was true. But he said there was another part of him, one that existed before any of that, one he had spent 11 years praying I would never need to meet. He said today, unfortunately, I was going to meet it. Colonel Hale's forces began advancing across the plaza exactly as the 60-second deadline expired, moving with the same eerie coordination that had allowed them to bypass our entire defense grid undetected. My own soldiers opened fire in response, and for a moment the plaza became a storm of light and sound, energy weapons clashing against armor that seemed to absorb far more punishment than it should have. Ethan moved before the first shot even landed. I have spent every day since trying to properly describe what I witnessed in the following minutes, and I still find the words inadequate. He did not run toward the fighting so much as become part of it instantly, closing distance that should have taken several seconds in what felt like a single heartbeat. The first soldier who turned to intercept him ended up disarmed and unconscious against the plaza stones before his companions even registered that Ethan had moved at all. It was not violence in the way my people understood violence, all brute strength and overwhelming force. It was something closer to a conversation conducted at impossible speed, each of Ethan's movements answering a question his opponents had not yet finished asking. He redirected strikes rather than blocking them outright, used his attackers' own momentum against them, disabled rather than destroyed wherever he possibly could, though the sheer number of Hale's forces occasionally left him no gentler option. My own soldiers, trained warriors who had served in real conflicts across multiple systems, stood frozen at the edges of the plaza, weapons lowered, simply watching a man they had dismissed for years as my harmless, weaponless husband move through an armored force, 20 strong, as though he were the only person on that plaza who fully understood what was actually happening. General Vask found me on the observation platform partway through the engagement, his face pale beneath years of battle-worn scarring. He asked me, in a voice barely above a whisper, what exactly my husband had been before the burial moon, before the garden, before the quiet evenings teaching our daughter about kindness. I told him honestly that I did not know. Not anymore. Perhaps I never had. Colonel Hale himself remained near the warship throughout the engagement, watching with an expression of grim, patient satisfaction rather than concern, as though the outcome unfolding before us was already exactly what he had expected. When roughly half his forces lay disabled across the plaza, he finally raised a hand, calling a temporary halt, and the remaining soldiers withdrew several paces, weapons still raised but no longer advancing. He called out to Ethan directly then, using that same cold designation instead of any name I recognized, his voice carrying easily across the sudden quiet that had fallen over the plaza. He said the directive had not sent their entire force expecting an easy collection. He said they had prepared, specifically, for exactly this outcome. He said Ethan's continued resistance was, in his words, both expected and entirely unnecessary. Then he gestured toward the warship, and its hatch opened wider, revealing something my scouts had not detected on any of their sensors, something that had apparently been waiting inside the vessel this entire time. Ethan went completely still when he saw it, and for the first time since the confrontation began, I saw genuine alarm cross his face. I did not yet understand what emerged from that ship, or why it changed the entire nature of this fight, or why my husband, who had just single-handedly disabled a dozen armored soldiers without visible effort, suddenly looked at that opening hatch the way a man looks at a memory he had hoped had been permanently destroyed. Before that hatch had opened, in the strange, suspended quiet of the halted fight, I found myself remembering every small warning I had chosen to ignore across 11 years, the servant's startled wrist, the courier pinned soundlessly against a corridor wall, the way Ethan always seemed to know where every exit in a room was located without ever appearing to look. Every fragment I had folded away into the comfortable story of my harmless husband now rose to the surface at once, no longer separate incidents, but pieces of a single picture I had simply refused to assemble. I glanced at Wren's tutors, gathered nervously near the palace entrance below, relieved to see them holding her back from the windows despite her clear determination to watch. I glanced at Soren, whose earlier scorn for my marriage had dissolved into something closer to fear, and at Vask, whose hand rested on his weapon, though his eyes never left the plaza, as if some part of him already understood that his own forces would not be the ones to decide this outcome. I would understand within moments, and understanding it would change everything I believed I knew about the harmless, gentle man I had married 11 years earlier on a moon reserved only for the dead. What emerged from the warship was not a weapon in the way I had first assumed, not a machine or a device meant to overwhelm my husband through sheer firepower. It was a person, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the same unnatural stillness Ethan carried, dressed in the same matte armor as Hale's soldiers but marked with a single band of color across the shoulder that clearly set him apart from the rest. Ethan's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a weight I had never heard from him before, not even in our most private, honest conversations. He said a name, quietly, almost gently, the way someone speaks the name of a person they once loved and lost under circumstances too painful to fully explain. The man from the ship did not respond with words, only a slow, deliberate nod, as though confirming something that needed no further discussion between them. Colonel Hale, watching from the plaza's edge, explained the rest to me directly, perhaps out of some twisted courtesy, perhaps simply because he enjoyed the look of dawning horror crossing my face as he spoke. He told me that Ethan Cole was not the name my husband had been born with, and that the Ashen Directive was not a hunting party in the way I had imagined, but the remnant of a program that had once trained a small handful of individuals from Earth for purposes Hale described only as necessary and unfortunate. He said Ethan had been among the very best the program ever produced, so effective that even his own instructors had eventually grown afraid of what they had created. He said Ethan had walked away from that program 11 years ago, disappearing so completely that the directive had spent every year since searching for him across systems even they had believed uncharted. He said the man who now stood across the plaza, the one Ethan had spoken to by name, had been Ethan's closest friend during those years, trained alongside him until loyalty to the program eventually placed them on opposite sides of whatever quiet, painful history existed between them. I listened to all of this with a strange, hollow feeling settling into my chest, watching the two men study each other across the space between them. 20 years or more of shared history, compressed into a silence neither seemed willing to break first. It was Ethan's former friend who finally moved, and when he did, I understood immediately why Hale had waited to deploy him until every other soldier had already failed. He moved with the exact same fluid precision Ethan possessed, matching him strike for strike, redirection for redirection, in an exchange so fast and so evenly matched that my own eyes struggled to track individual movements at all. It was less like watching a fight and more like watching two forces of nature collide, each one perfectly countering the other, neither gaining ground for several long, breathless minutes. I found myself gripping the observation platform railing hard enough to hurt, watching my husband, the same man who apologized to servants and grew vegetables and taught our daughter that kindness mattered more than strength, fight for his life against someone who had once shared every part of the history he had spent 11 years trying to bury. General Vask stood beside me now, his earlier suspicion replaced entirely by something closer to stunned respect. He told me, quietly, that in all his decades of service, he had never witnessed combat of this caliber, not from any soldier, trained under any banner he had ever encountered. He said whatever program had created these two men had clearly succeeded beyond anything the directive itself had likely anticipated, and that succeeding this completely had apparently frightened them enough to want it erased. The turning point came when Ethan's former friend made a single, small miscalculation, perhaps the first genuine mistake either man had made in the entire exchange. He overcommitted to a strike meant to end the confrontation quickly, and Ethan, reading the movement a fraction of a second before it landed, redirected it with enough precision to leave his opponent momentarily exposed. I watched Ethan hesitate. It was barely visible, less than a full second, but I saw it clearly from the platform above, the moment where my husband, capable of ending this confrontation entirely, chose instead to simply disable rather than finish what years of training had clearly prepared him to complete. He struck with controlled restraint instead, ending the exchange with his former friend unconscious but breathing, laid gently against the plaza stones rather than left in worse condition. Colonel Hale's expression shifted for the first time since his arrival, something like genuine surprise crossing his otherwise composed features. He called out to Ethan again, asking, almost curiously, why he had chosen restraint when the directive itself had shown him none over the years they had spent hunting him across the stars. Ethan's answer carried clearly across the now silent plaza, and I have replayed it in my mind every day since. He said he had spent 11 years learning that strength meant nothing if a person could not also choose gentleness, when gentleness was the harder, more painful option. He said he had left the directive not because he feared what he was capable of, but because he had grown to hate what that capability had cost him. Friendships turned into rivalries, purpose turned into a life spent running, a version of himself he no longer recognized in the mirror each morning. He said the only thing he had ever wanted, since the day he stepped off his crashed ship onto a burial moon and found a stranger who chose not to end his life, was the chance to become someone entirely different from what the directive had built him to be. Colonel Hale considered this for a long moment, glancing toward his remaining soldiers, still scattered across the plaza in various states of disabled defeat, then toward his unconscious agent lying peacefully against the stones. He seemed, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely uncertain of his next move. It was my turn to speak, and I did not hesitate. I stepped down from the observation platform, past Vask's restraining hand, past Soren's whispered warning, walking directly into the open plaza, where my husband stood breathing hard but steady, blood present but minor along one arm, watching me approach with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. I told Colonel Hale, in the same voice I used to address hostile delegations across 40 worlds, that whatever debt he believed Ethan owed his organization had clearly already been paid in full, measured across 11 years of a man choosing peace over violence at every single opportunity available to him. I told him that my empire now stood fully behind my husband, and that any further attempt to remove him from this territory would be treated not as a personal matter between old colleagues, but as a direct act of aggression against the entire Threnai dominion. I do not know, even now, whether my threat carried any real weight against a force capable of bypassing our entire defense grid without detection. Perhaps Hale simply recognized that continuing this confrontation would cost him more than he was willing to spend. Perhaps some part of him, watching his own agent disabled but spared, understood that he had already lost something more valuable than the mission itself. Whatever his reasoning, Colonel Hale eventually gave the order to withdraw. His remaining soldiers gathered their fallen companions, loaded them back aboard the silent warship, and within minutes, the vessel that had entered our sky, without triggering a single alarm, lifted away just as quietly, disappearing beyond our outer defense grid as though it had never arrived at all. The plaza fell into a strange, disoriented silence once the ship had gone, my own soldiers slowly lowering their weapons, staring at Ethan with expressions I had never seen directed at him before, equal parts fear and awe and something close to reverence. I turned to my husband, standing alone in the center of a plaza he had just defended without a single fatal blow, and found him looking not triumphant, not relieved, but simply, quietly heartbroken. He told me, before I could say anything at all, that he was sorry, not for what he had just done, but for everything he had never told me. Every quiet evening he had let me believe a comfortable story instead of a complicated truth. Every small inconsistency I had noticed and chosen, out of love, not to examine too closely. I did not yet know exactly how to respond to that. I only knew, standing in that plaza with my husband's blood staining one sleeve and an entire empire watching us in stunned silence, that the man I loved had never once been dishonest with me about who he truly was inside. He had simply, for 11 years, been protecting me from needing to know it. Behind us, the plaza remained scattered with the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. Soldiers slowly rising, medical staff moving carefully among the disabled, the strange band-marked man from the warship already gone, carried back aboard by his own retreating comrades. None of it looked like the aftermath of a great victory. It looked instead like the exhausted quiet that follows something no one fully wanted to happen in the first place, a silence made of relief and disbelief in equal measure. I noticed Wren's tutors finally allowing her toward the entrance, her small figure breaking into a run the moment she saw her father still standing. Ethan knelt immediately to meet her, ignoring the ache clearly written across his own body, gathering her close with the same gentle patience he had shown her every single day of her life. Watching them together in that moment, I understood that whatever else had been revealed that afternoon, the tenderness between them had never once been part of the performance. The palace remained in a strange, unsettled quiet for days after Colonel Hale's warship disappeared beyond our defense grid, and I found myself walking through corridors I had known my entire life as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Wren was the first person I sought out once the plaza had cleared. I found her exactly where Ethan had left her, tucked safely within an interior chamber with two of my most trusted guards standing watch, her small face pressed anxiously against the window, despite every instruction to stay away from it. She asked me immediately whether her father was safe, and when I told her yes, she asked a second question that struck me harder than I expected, whether her father was still the same person he had been that morning. I did not have a complete answer for her yet. I only held her close and told her that some questions take a little more time to answer properly. Minister Soren approached me later that same evening, her earlier disdain for my marriage replaced entirely by a kind of cautious, calculating respect that unsettled me almost as much as the battle itself had. She told me the border provinces were already buzzing with reports of what had happened in the capital plaza, and that our standing among neighboring systems had shifted overnight, no longer defined by the size of our fleet or the reach of our borders, but by the fact that our ruler's own husband had single-handedly repelled an unknown power capable of bypassing technology no other empire had ever managed to breach. I told her I had not married Ethan for political advantage, and she agreed, though she noted, not unkindly, that the advantage existed regardless of my intentions. General Vask sought me out as well, and his conversation stayed with me longer than any other that week. He told me he owed my husband an apology, one he intended to deliver personally, for every quiet suspicion he had voiced against a man who had ultimately protected this palace with more skill and more restraint than any soldier under Vask's own command could have managed. He said watching Ethan choose to disable rather than destroy, even against an opponent who had once been his closest friend, taught him something about strength he had never learned in decades of military service. I found Ethan himself in the garden 3 days after the confrontation, kneeling among the same strange vegetables he had grown since his earliest days in the palace, his hands moving through familiar soil with a steadiness that looked, for the first time since the plaza, like something approaching peace. I sat beside him without speaking at first, watching him work, until he finally set his tools aside and turned to face me directly. He told me everything then, the full history he had spent 11 years keeping carefully hidden beneath quiet evenings and gentle stories. He told me about a program on Earth designed to create operatives capable of handling threats no ordinary soldier could face, about the years he spent training alongside a small handful of others who eventually became the closest thing he had to family, about the mission that finally broke something inside him, one he described only briefly, painfully, enough for me to understand that it had cost innocent lives he had been unable to save, despite every skill the program had given him. He told me he had walked away after that mission, disappearing so completely that even his former friends could not locate him, boarding whatever transport he could find, eventually ending up on a research vessel that carried him further from Earth than any of the program's operatives had ever traveled before. He said the crash that brought him to my burial moon had not been an accident in the way I always assumed, but the final, desperate outcome of a man who had been running so long and so far that he had simply stopped caring whether he survived the journey at all. He said finding me standing over him, choosing mercy instead of the judgment his own crash should have earned him under Threnai law, had been the first moment in years he remembered wanting to live. I asked him, gently, why he had never told me any of this before the confrontation forced his hand. He considered the question for a long moment before answering, and his answer reshaped everything I understood about the man I had married. He said he had not hidden his past to deceive me, but to protect the life we were building together from a history he had hoped, desperately, would never catch up to either of us. He said every day he spent in that garden, every evening he spent teaching Ren about kindness, every quiet moment he spent simply existing as a gentle husband and father, had been a deliberate choice, proof to himself that the person the directive had built was not the only person he was capable of becoming. He said he had never lied about being harmless, because in every way that mattered to our daily life, he genuinely was. The other version of himself, the one capable of what the plaza had witnessed, existed only because circumstances occasionally demanded it, not because it represented who he wanted to be. I told him I understood, and I meant it completely, though I admitted the version of him I had witnessed in that plaza would take time to fully reconcile with the gentle man who had shared my bed and raised my daughter for over a decade. He nodded, accepting that honestly, without argument. In the weeks that followed, our life slowly found its rhythm again, though it was a rhythm subtly changed by everything the confrontation had revealed. My court no longer whispered about my harmless human husband with quiet condescension. Instead, they regarded him with a wary respect he clearly found more uncomfortable than the earlier mockery had ever been. He told me once, quietly, that he preferred being underestimated, because being feared meant people kept a careful distance, and he had spent enough of his life feeling isolated by what others assumed about his capabilities. Ren asked him more questions in those weeks than she had asked in her entire life before, and he answered each one patiently, honestly, without the gentle deflections he had used in earlier years. He told her about his old friends from the training program, about the mission that changed him, about the specific reasons he had chosen our quiet garden over whatever life the directive had once mapped out for him. She listened to all of it with the serious concentration only children seem capable of, and when he finished, she simply told him she was glad the burial moon had not killed him before her mother arrived. He laughed at that, a genuine, unguarded sound I had not heard from him since before the confrontation, and something in his shoulders finally seemed to loosen. Colonel Hale never returned to Threnai space, though reports occasionally drifted in from distant border provinces suggesting the Ashen Directive had quietly abandoned its pursuit entirely. perhaps recognizing, as I had told him directly in that plaza, that the cost of continuing outweighed whatever value remained in capturing a man who had clearly already built a life beyond their reach. Ethan's former friend, the one he had defeated with such visible reluctance, sent a single encrypted message through neutral channels months later, containing only a brief acknowledgement that he understood, finally, why Ethan had chosen to disappear all those years ago. Ethan read that message alone in the garden, and though he never told me exactly what it said, beyond that basic summary, I watched something in him settle afterward, a weight he had carried quietly for over a decade finally set down. I think often about the 11 years I spent believing my husband was simply harmless, a gentle curiosity from a burial moon who grew vegetables and apologized too much and taught our daughter that kindness mattered above all else. I understand now that harmless was never quite the right word, and perhaps it never had been. He was capable of things that still occasionally wake me from uneasy dreams, movements and decisions born from a history far darker than the quiet life we built together ever suggested. But I also understand something else now, something I did not fully grasp until I watched him choose restraint over destruction in that plaza, until I heard him explain, in his own careful words, why he had walked away from everything the directive built him to become. My husband was never harmless. He was simply the strongest person I have ever known, strong enough to hold immense capability inside himself for over a decade and choose, every single day, gentleness instead. Strong enough to grow vegetables instead of empires, to teach kindness instead of conquest, to build a quiet life with a woman and a daughter who loved him without ever needing to fully understand what he was capable of protecting them from. I married a man I believed was harmless. What I actually married was someone who loved us enough to let me believe that, for as long as the universe allowed him to. And when his enemies finally arrived, he did not become someone new. He simply, for one difficult afternoon, let me see all of who he had always been. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when Wren has gone to sleep and the garden has settled into its own gentle darkness, I ask him to tell me small pieces of that earlier life, not out of any lingering suspicion, but because I have finally learned that understanding all of him only makes the love between us steadier, not more fragile. He tells me carefully, sometimes with humor, sometimes with a heaviness that still catches in his voice, and each time I am reminded that the man kneeling beside me in the soil, hands patient and careful with every seed he plants, chose this life deliberately, against every alternative his history could have offered him instead. My court has changed too, in ways I did not expect. Young officers now ask, quietly, whether the gentle husband from the burial moon might one day agree to teach them something of what they witnessed in that plaza. Ethan always declines, gently, saying that what he carries is not something meant to be passed forward, only something meant to be set down as completely as a person is able. I have come to respect that answer more than I respect most of the counsel offered in my war room. Wren, for her part, has grown into a young woman who understands, better than most children raised among power ever do, that true strength rarely announces itself loudly. She tends the garden alongside her father most mornings, asking him questions about Earth, about oceans she may never see, about a small brick schoolhouse that shaped a version of him long before any program or any warship ever did. I watch them together and think, often, that whatever the directive once built inside my husband, it never came close to building the version of him that matters most, the one currently kneeling in soil, laughing quietly at something our daughter has said, utterly and completely at peace. I still rule 40 worlds. I still sit through councils filled with generals who measure worth in claws and rank, ministers who mistake sharpness for wisdom. But I have learned, from a man who once crashed broken and bleeding onto a moon reserved for the dead, that the deepest strength a person can hold is the quiet, daily choice to remain gentle in a universe that has given them every reason not to be. That, more than anything his enemies ever revealed about him, is the truth I chose to marry. And it is the truth, gladly, that I would choose again.